Welcome back to Everard Junction. In today's video we're going to do some ballasting on these new curves. I'm going to add some ground cover in between those tracks and that ballast. A few small details in a few places, just getting started on some of that. And I'm also going to correct a couple of dips and troughs in the track, just making sure everything is absolutely level before I actually commit to the ballasting that you can see in front of you. So we'll start off with levelling up the track and just sorting out any small problems, and then we'll move on to the ballasting and other bits and pieces. So I'm getting ready to ballast these two outer tracks in this section here, but before I do the ballasting, it's very important to make sure that everything is running properly and everything is nice and level. So I've got my trusty red pen and I'm going to go around and mark any bits of the track that are not perfectly level and I'm not happy with. Once track has been ballasted, any bumps and dips that cause derailments or look bad can be quite difficult to resolve without causing major damage to the track. However, it is possible, but it's quite a lot of a faff. So what I like to do is just make sure when the track is in this earlier stage that we get everything absolutely right before we entomb it in the stones and the glue mix. So on these tracks in the foreground, I've worked hard to make sure that those are all nice and straight and level all the way around this curve, and you can see I've committed to ballasting those. One section I missed on that part was this bit here, and we'll just play a clip from the last video now. And I didn't actually notice this until editing that video. The camera is very good at picking up issues in the track, so you can see there's a very slight dip there, and although it's not causing any problems, it's going to annoy me. So what I did last week was I went ahead and fixed this, and with it all ballasted, it is quite a task. So after I realised that there was a dip in the track here, it was about 1mm, so nothing crazy, but it's important to remember that 1mm in 00 scale is 76mm in real life. So that represents a relatively significant dip in the track over a short distance that in real life you would hope somebody like Network Rail would strive to avoid. So to resolve it, I take a small container like this one. This is a lid for an Oxford die-cast car, part of the packaging they come with. I always keep these, they're really useful, use them for all sorts of stuff. Put some very hot water into there and then pour it all over the ballast in this section, and what that does is it softens the PVA glue in the ballast and it allows you to manipulate the track very carefully. So with the glue all soft, what I was able to do was take a very small flat bladed screwdriver and tease the sleepers, each one in turn, in the upwards direction, and just very gently tease the track up slightly on both sides. And then I kept rechecking that with the steel rule until I got something that was perfectly flat and level, and once I was happy that I'd lifted the track sufficiently, I then applied a small sprinkling of ballast to fill up any issues that I'd caused whilst working on the track with a screwdriver, and then reapplied the PVA and glue mix to the entire area and left that for several days to set. So this ballast is now harder than the seats on a Class 700, so I know the track isn't going to move anymore, and rechecking that with the steel rule, you can see it looks really nice and level and flat. So if we go to the same spot again and watch the trains go past, it should look significantly better. So let's see how much better it looks versus the previous go. So yeah, it's very telling as those SSA wagons move across that section. It's not 100% perfect, but it's certainly a significant improvement over before. And then we'll send a 47 going the other way. And this bit's a little bit more of a challenge because you've got two sets of points there, and it's always a little bit difficult to get everything 100%. Again, that looks pretty good. You can see that yellow band on the pair of cargo wagons at the front, how that lined up as the train travelled across the section. So there's not too much up and down motion from the wagons. So I'll call that section fixed, and we'll just make sure that we try and avoid any of that in future on these two outer sections. So I've been watching the trains quite a bit on those two tracks, and although the one closer to the camera seems actually quite good, we'll just double check it, but it seems to be okay. The outermost track does seem to have a couple of lumps and bumps in it, so we're just going to double check that with a steel rule. And there is a gap there, so there's a dip in the track. The outer rail, it's even worse, so probably 2mm at its worst, which is why it looks a bit funny when the train's going around the corner. Yeah, it's not as bad on the inside rail. So this track in roughly this area here needs a little bit of a lift. So I've just marked with a pen where the problem starts and finishes. So it's this whole section here on this track only. Now the track is glued down with rocket card glue. Sleepers are glued onto the wedges from West Hill Wagon Works that give the track the nice realistic look to the banking, and then those are glued with rocket card glue to the cork bed, the 4mm cork underneath. So I should be able to just get in there with a screwdriver or a knife and just gently tease these wedges away from the cork, and then we can put a plastic shim underneath all of those to lift the track by the correct amount, and then we can check with the steel rule that everything is correct. And for reference, there you can see the issue. See the gap between the rail and the rule? That's the dip in the track, so about 2mm, and we should be able to fix it. So to do this, got to be very careful. I'm going to take a blunt Stanley blade that's not in a knife, because there is no room to work here, and very carefully push it underneath the wedges and just tease at them, hoping that I can release the glue. Okay, so I've run all the way along the problem area with the blunt Stanley blade, just teasing it away from the glue. So all of the wedges are still stuck to the track, but they're no longer stuck to the cork bed, and we should now be able to use some plastic to shim the track into the correct position and then check that it's lined up with the steel rule. And incidentally, sort of back in the 1930s, 1940s, this was a similar thing that they used to do to level the track. You would lift each sleeper in turn, and then you would place a packing underneath the sleeper, which was a very fine gravel. They would measure out specific quantities depending on what they wanted to do, and they would literally pack gravel underneath the sleeper, and it would lift that sleeper and correct issues with the track work, and they would do that as and when they found problems on their daily maintenance.
The standard canister is used. It is always filled the same amount, and the chippings are evenly spread. The packing goes on until all the marked sleepers have been dealt with. Then the ballast shoulder is squared up, and the whole job left neat and tidy.
I've cut out a few scrap pieces of very thin plastic, that's about 0.5 mm, and I've just put them in a couple of strategic places. So there's a pair underneath those wedges, mostly on the inside rail, and then there's one over here, just on the inside rail again. You'll also notice that wedge doesn't go all the way under. That's just so you get a smoother transition, because the wedges here are a slightly smaller size. So far it seems to be looking quite good, nice and level. If you watch the bogies on the coaches, you see how they bob up and down, which they don't appear to be doing. So it looks pretty smooth. I'll check the next track, that one just there. Surely that's got to have some issues, so I'll correct that and then just check the rest of it, and then we go ahead and commit to ballasting all this stuff. I've just applied some Deluxe Materials rocket card glue to secure all that into position. It'd be tempting to put some weights on it, but that is resting exactly where it needs to be. The glue will secure it for the time being, and then once all of that is filled with the ballast and secured with a large amount of glue, that track won't go anywhere. The next track does also have the same problem, albeit not quite as badly. So once again, I've placed a mark where the problem starts and the problem finishes. You get the idea now, so I'll go ahead and make sure these two curves are as level as they possibly can be, and then we'll come back and get on with the ballasting. Okay, I've gone ahead and finished all of the levelling. So I did a section in there, and then I also found another small section just here. Didn't need too much on the outer track only. So I'm quite happy with how that's looking now. It's about as good as it's going to get, and the trains are now even smoother than how they were before. The ballast I'll be using today is Woodland Scenics. I particularly like the fine ballast. It's got a real nice fine texture to it, and it looks quite convincing for 00 scale. I've used this and various other ballasts around the layout, and nothing seems to get quite as close to the fine texture as the fine Woodland Scenics ballast. So I'll be sticking with that on this section, and as you can see I've got 4 different colours there, and what I like to do is mix them up into different blends so that we get different effects for different tracks in different places. Rarely in real life do you come across exactly the same colour of ballast for multiple tracks. Usually one is more recently replaced than the other, and the stones that are used to ballast it are fresher or a different colour from a different quarry. While it's certainly neater and tidier to go for the same colour for every single track, I try and go for that sort of more grimy, realistic appearance that you would commonly see on a multi-track area such as this. For these tracks, I think I'm going to stick mostly to the 2 greys and throw in some of the buff. We'll see how that looks. I want to make these two perhaps look a little bit different, a little bit fresher to say these two. Don't want them looking exactly the same. So there we have the colours mixed together. You can see the buff, the grey and the light grey all in there, but there's no brown, which makes it look a little bit different to what we have here. So I'll lay some of this down and see how the contrast looks. Okay, so it's only just loosely laid, but you get the idea. We've got a nice contrast of different colours across the tracks just there, and then we've also got these old sidings over here which have much more of the brown ballast in them, giving a look of sort of disuse and age. So I'm quite happy with that. This fresh stuff here will darken in colour when it's glued, so it's worth bearing that in mind, but I'm quite happy with the colours we've got going on there. So I'm going to continue this all the way around, but we'll stop short of the point work just up there because I haven't fully finished what we're going to do in terms of the point work into the siding. So the next thing to do, again much like the railway in real life, what they'll use is a machine called a tamping machine, and it comes along and it basically shakes the living daylights out of all of the stones, and it shakes everything off of the tops of the sleepers and gets everything settled around the sleepers and deep into the foundations of the track. So I'll be doing something similar, just this plastic tub. I'll just be tapping the rails like that, a little bit of vibration, and it just sets all of the stones into position and gets most of the excess stones away from the rails and off of the tops of the sleepers. And then I can just go and do a few more touch-ups with a small brush and just moving things around with your fingers, glue it down, come back tomorrow, and then apply any more ballast in areas that need it. I've finished spreading the ballast around, something that's quite handy when you're near the end to move most of it where you want to. Just take your thumb and just run it across the surface of the sleepers like that, and that will just displace any final stones that are sitting on the tops just there. You can see, of course, where it's not perfect. The shoulder on the ballast there is incomplete, but as I said earlier, what we'll do now is we'll go ahead and glue that down, and then when I come back tomorrow and apply more ballast over the top of this, the stones here that have been glued will act as a nice foundation for those additional stones. It's just going to be easier to build up the required shapes and definition, and eventually it will look like this pair of tracks here. It's very difficult to see on the camera, but here the ballast is noticeably higher than what it is, say, on this rail here, because of the banking of the curves. So with it all just loose, it can be quite difficult to build up those required shapes. So I'll glue it, come back tomorrow, put some more down. Gluing the ballast down is very simple. I've got a spray bottle that I've saved from the kitchen, and it's just got some water with a splash of dishwashing detergent in there, basically known as wet water, and that will help soak the ballast, get it all nice and wet, and allow the glue to soak in there really well. The glue itself is just regular cheap white glue from the hardware store mixed with water, 50% glue, 50% water, and again a splash of dishwashing detergent as well. So I'll soak the ballast down with the spray bottle, and then using a plastic eyedropper, I'll suck up some of that glue mix, soak it into the ballast, and keep applying it until it's fully saturated with glue, and then leave it for a day or two to cure. I'll leave that for 24 hours minimum, but if it needs it, I'll leave it for a couple of days. We'll see how the weather goes, see how warm it stays up here. But once that's all dried rock hard, we'll come back, go over it again with some more ballast, and it would just be a little bit easier then to get the final shape and definition and get in all those tight little spots without having to worry about all of it blowing away or moving around. That's the problem with ballast. When you've got large quantities of it like this, it can be a little bit tricky to work with, so I tend to do it in a couple of stages. So I've left it to dry for 48 hours. It's not 100% cured, it's still slightly soft, but it'll be okay because we're going to apply more ballast to it anyway. So this will serve as a great foundation now for building up the shoulders on the outside of the curve where it's got that sort of tip in the banking. So I'll be applying the same mix of colours again. As you can see on this curve here, it's very thin in places. You can see the 3D printed wedges showing through. So we'll make sure that gets all sorted out. So it's been several days while I've been letting the ballast dry. Got a little bit cold with the weather, so it takes a little bit longer sometimes for the ballast to cure. In the meantime, I've prepared a few other bits and pieces for the area ahead of doing some of the detailing. So I've started planning out some of the cable troughing for the far side. I've put a couple of relay boxes in position as well. A similar thing to what we've got over here. This cable troughing continues off camera and terminates in a series of relay boxes. I thought it'd be nice to have something similar on the other side of the line, but in a different spot so we don't have any symmetry. This area between the main lines and the sidings just going to be basically a bit of waste ground. Going to have some used bits of rail and random detail, the odd pallet, whatever, just random junk basically that's been tossed in there by passing maintenance teams. It's not big enough to really put any form of structure or anything, and I want to be able to see the trains stabled in the background, so a little bit of detail would look really nice, but I don't want to do anything huge that's going to dominate the scene. I've put a little stores hut or sort of shed at the end of this bridge girder, so people will walk through here to gain access to this building. They go between those two bridge girders, and then just beyond that basically is just rubbish and waste ground and the odd bit of infrastructure. The main change since the last clip is the addition of these bridge girders. These are the Pico ones. They have a slightly curved profile to the top of them, and I quite like those. Not used them on the layout before, so I thought I'd give them a whirl so we don't end up using the Wills girders absolutely everywhere. And these also happen to be the perfect length for the street that is underneath this section of the layout. And as you can see, where I have enough space, I've put a girder in between the tracks. So we've got one here and then two there, and then there'll be some more in the background so that it looks authentic, but also creates a story. You don't just look at this bit in the front and go, oh, that's a bridge. You'll see this going across here and you'll go, oh right, that's a bridge, and you'll actually be able to see where it goes and what the route of the road underneath is. And if we look from this angle, you can very clearly see the girder, the road, and then the sort of route that the road is taking underneath the layout. I've painted these the same colour as the girders a little bit further around by the canal. Given their proximity, I figured probably whoever looks after them would have probably just painted them all the same colour. And of course I've gone ahead and done quite a bit of weathering and added some graffiti to them. I know graffiti isn't everybody's cup of tea, but certainly if you're modelling the railway from the last 50 years, graffiti is a fact of life, and if you don't include it, it can look a bit weird and your model looks a little bit too pristine, shall we say. These are all just hand painted with a small brush, just used a bit of inspiration, looked at some pictures online, and then just sort of free-handed a random bit of graffiti on there. Not perfect, but certainly better than just having a pristine green girder. And also you can see I've added a couple of rust streaks, a few chips in the paint, things like that. Underneath the girder there'll be a second one, a little bit set into the bridge. That's something you see sometimes on these girders. Thought it'd make a nice little bit of detail and differentiate this bit of bridge from the one round the corner. I've also adjusted the intensity of the graffiti on each girder. This one by the road, it's the one that everybody's going to see, and it's also the easiest to get to. So if you're that way inclined, you're going to graffiti this one first before you cross the lines and graffiti the others. So the level of graffiti gradually decreases all the way to the last girder, and in fact the last girder doesn't have any graffiti on it at all. There you can see the girders further away, and you can see how this graffiti sort of runs out as you get closer and closer to that side of the layout. Obviously the girder on the far end, which would then be the road coming out the other side, that would then be heavily graffitied again as it's easy to access from the street. So while I've been doing all of that, this ballast has now well and truly dried. I've removed the excess, so you do get a few stones and things sort of stuck to the sides of the rails. I just take a small screwdriver and just run along the edge of the rails like so, and it will just chip off any of those loose stones that sort of ended up where you don't want them to be. A quick vacuum and then that's all good, and the train's now running again. So the next thing to do is to focus on the ground cover that goes between the sidings and these lines here. Going to go for sort of hard packed, sort of dirty finish, not straight ballast. That'd look a little bit too clean and fresh in my opinion. So we'll be going for the tiling grout, which I've used previously in a few areas. I'll show you how that looks. So there's some that I've done previously. As you can see, it sort of creates that nice sort of a dense, hard packed area without having to just put ballast over everything. I have sprinkled a few ballast stones in there, as of course, you know, the lines either side with all the ballast they've got, some of it's going to go astray and go into that area, but certainly just something a little bit different. And once again, if we look between the tracks, you can see a bit that I've done about an hour ago. Obviously that's still drying, so it's a little bit blotchy in colour. Once the excess has been removed, that should look quite good, and it just fades the ballast out to almost nothing, and then the ballast builds up again on the other side. So I'll do the same thing now over here. I've glued down the relay boxes. I think they look much better if they're sort of set into the ground cover that you put down. So they're glued down, but I have masked up where the cable troughing is going to go and where the little hut is going to go. Cable troughing, normally I would install that first, but I've run out. I've used the last of it, so I need to get some more of that ordered, but it doesn't matter. I can just touch that in later on. As I want this to look flat and I'm not really trying to build up large quantities of material, we're just going to brush some glue onto this surface, this plywood surface here. Just brush all of the glue mix around there, 50-50 mix of glue and water, and then just sprinkle the scatter on top. That'll dry a little bit faster, and the excess I can save for later on another project. Here's the mix of material. This is grey tiling grout mixed in with a little bit of the Woodland Scenics grey and brown fine ballast, and only a small quantity of that, and you can see how the dust from the grout has discoloured it as well. So we've got a nice sort of varied tone there. Once this is dried, it can also be painted. I don't intend on keeping it the sort of standard naked finish. There's going to be dirt and dust and weathering and all sorts of stuff to go over the top of this, but this is certainly a good base layer, much better than just bare plywood. That's now dried, and I've removed the masking tape that I put down for that cable troughing. I'll get some of that ordered and fit it over the next week or so. The next job to do is to start weathering all of this, get some different tones going on in there, paint some of that ground cover, getting it looking a little bit more sort of dirty, grimy, and we can then start adding some foliage to the sidings, a little bit of grass and stuff growing in between the tracks, as you often see, especially back during the 80s when a lot of stuff was falling into disuse. And we'll also start adding little details and bits of scrap and random bits and pieces in and around that shed and those boxes, and it should be a nice little area to fill up between the tracks. While all of that's been drying, I've done a little bit of work over on this side. I've decided against the fitting of a single slip in this area here, and what I've done instead is I've gone for a scissor junction, which is more realistic. The single slip tends to not be seen on major running lines. You'll find them in sidings, but not on a major running line. So after quite a bit of thought and a couple of comments in the last video, I thought maybe we'll go for a scissor junction instead. There's a little bit more work to lay it, obviously, and I had to make a few changes to a little bit of the work I'd already done, but it was easy enough to implement it. I've also moved this bit of retaining wall further into the railway, so it's straightened up these girders and realigned everything on the retaining wall side with the new edge of the baseboard. And while I was doing that, I've also added some of the Wills girders to complement these ones that I already have on this side, to give the illusion of the support sort of steel work for the bridge going through to that side of the track. And indeed we'll be doing the similar thing over on this side when I eventually scenic this bit and tie it all in. So there you go, hope you enjoyed it. I'll leave you with a few running shots of trains over the newly ballasted lines, and we'll come back in a future video and start adding a little bit more grime, detail and additional scenery to this area.